Hola, buenas noches. Gracias por unirse al Instituto Político de Dole esta noche. Me llamo Bella Casco y soy miembro de la Junta Asesora Estudiantes, el grupo estudiantil oficial del instituto. A beneficio a la Junta Asesora Estudiantil, me gustaría darle las bienvenidas virtuales a Presidente Santos. Nuestros estudiantes están viendo en casa y muy emocionados por este programa. And now I will repeat that in English. Good evening. Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for the program this evening. My name is Bella Koskol, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official group of the Institute for Students. On behalf of the Student Advisory Board, I would like to welcome you, President Santos, virtually to the Dole Institute. Our students are tuning in at home and are excited for this evening's program. For tonight's event, if you would like to know more about our guest, the event itself, upcoming Institute events, and more, you can download a printable program handout. The link is in the event description below. At the end of the event tonight, we will have time for you to ask questions of our guest. Please email those questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. And now, please join me in welcoming the Director of the Institute, Bill Lacy.
Thank you very much, Bella. What a great welcome, and very much appreciate that. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. I want to begin tonight by recognizing two very important co-sponsors who helped us organize and secure this program. First is the University Press of Kansas. Secondly, the Kansas University Alumni Association. We appreciate the support and help from both of those organizations. Secondly, I'd like to tell everyone that our discussion tonight will be based on the president's book. The book is called The Battle for will have bookplate signed by the president that will be available from the Dole Institute. Instructions should be on our YouTube page. Now it's my great honor to introduce the Chancellor of the University of Kansas, Chancellor Doug Girod. Chancellor?
Good evening and welcome to the Digital Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Doug Girod and I am the 18th Chancellor of the University of Kansas. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Bill Lacy, Director of the Dole Institute of Politics. Our guest this evening is President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia. I'm really excited to welcome President Santos back to the University of Kansas for this conversation. President Santos is an alumnus of the University of Kansas, and I had the great pleasure of presenting him with an honorary doctorate degree from the university in 2017. President Santos is an accomplished economist and journalist, in addition to a leading public servant. He served as president of Colombia from 2010 to 2018. And during his administration, he helped end a civil war that had raged for 50 years in his country. For this work on these negotiations, he received the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize. In his new book, The Battle for Peace, he shares the lessons he learned about working towards peace in a seemingly impossible situation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the University of Kansas and the Dole Institute of Politics, President Juan Manuel Santos.
Mr. President, it's so great to have you back at the Dole Institute of Politics. As I said the other day when we talked, I wish we could be hosting you in person tonight.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Chancellor, for your kind words. Thank you, Bella, for the introduction, and Bill, thank you for being my interlocutor this evening. I'm very, very pleased to be back, even though it's virtually, in Kansas. I have Kansas in my heart since I spent 4 years there studying, and I never forget those wonderful years. So it's a great pleasure to be with you today, presenting my book, which I wrote after we finished the peace process. And I hope that this book would be useful for students who want to study how conflicts can be resolved, specific example, and how and what lessons can we learn from processes like the Colombian process. So again, thank you very much for having me and for this opportunity.
Well, it's great to have you here, sir. Can you start tonight by telling us about your time at the University of Kansas?
Of course. Many people ask me, how did you end up in Kansas? And the story is a very short but substantive story. My family, since my grandfather, we've been journalist, newspaper business. And my older brother was seeking a university to study journalism. And my father had a good friend. He was the publisher of the Miami Herald, who stayed in my house. And my brother asked him, where should I go study a good school of journalism? And he said, his name was George Beebe, he said, a very good school of journalism, one of the best in the nation, is in Kansas. Kansas is in the middle of nowhere, but it's a beautiful campus and it's a great school of journalism. You can go and try it. And my brother went to Kansas. He married there, and one of his kids lives in Lawrence today. And he wrote to me and said, this is a great campus. You should come. You would love KU. And so I did, and I loved KU. And not only me, my younger brother and two of my cousins ended up being Jayhawks. So that's how I ended up in Kansas. I spent my first year at McCollum Hall, freshman. Then I joined a fraternity. I was a DU. There I learned something which was very useful for my life afterwards, playing poker. And I learned about the US because this friend of my father has said, if you want to really know what US is all about, what America is, go to Kansas. You will not find the same in the East Coast or in the West Coast. In Kansas, you will really internalize what the United States is. And so I did. And so I always carry Kansas and the University of Kansas in my heart.
Well, and he gave you very good advice, I think. Let me ask you, you had a number of roles in the Colombian government before you became president. Can you talk about how they helped prepare you to be president?
Of course. Before going to KU, I was in the Navy. I was 2.5 years in the Navy. That was very helpful in my life. Being in the military gives you discipline, gives you a lot of assets that would be very helpful in your life afterwards. Then I went to work with the Coffee Growers Federation. Colombia used to depend, almost 80% of our exports used to be coffee. And if I wanted to be a good economist, because I studied economics and business in KU, I had to learn about the coffee business. So I started working in Colombia, and very quickly I was transferred to London, because in London there was an organization, a United Nations organization called the International Coffee Organization, which administered a commodity agreement. At that time, the coffee trade in the world was controlled by quotas for producers and quotas for consumers. And so I went to London. I spent there 10 years. I studied there at the same time at the London School of Economics. I came back to Colombia to work as a journalist. I worked for 8 years as a journalist, and I was tempted to go into public service as the first Minister of Foreign Trade. that I accepted. I changed my life from being a journalist to being a public servant. I remember somebody, when I was seeking advice of if I should do that transfer or not, they told me, listen, in journalism, you will always have influence. But if you want to really make changes in your country and be able to participate in something important, you have to go into politics and into public service. There you will have real power in the good sense of the word. And that was true. And so I decided to go into public service. I was Minister of Foreign Trade, the first one in Colombia. I was responsible for opening up the economy. That was in the early 90s. I later, some years afterwards, was Minister of Finance at the worst economic recession we had since the Great Depression. That was a great experience. And then I was Minister of Defense for 4 years before becoming president. All these ministries helped me a lot to learn about how the government runs, how you have to balance different powers and influences in order to be effective in public service. I was taught about diplomacy and how important it is to have empathy with people. And so when I became president, I had experience in the defense sector, in the finance sector, in the trade and the diplomatic sector, and that helped me very much in my 8 years as president.
Mr. President, could you share with us why you decided to run for president of Colombia?
Well, I was obsessed about ending the war in Colombia. We have been a very violent country since our independence, and violence has been sort of a normal way of life in Colombia. And this war with the FARC, which was the oldest, the most powerful guerrilla movement in the whole of the Western Hemisphere. I remember saying, we need to end the war in order to be able to take off as a country. Those words were said to me by Nelson Mandela some years before, by foreign investors in New York when I went as Minister of Finance to seek foreign investment in my country, and said, as long as you have that war, your country will never take off. And so after being Minister of Defense, I had the opportunity, because I was very good at making war. I was very effective and was very popular. I had 80% of favorability, and so I ran for president in order to start a peace process with the guerrillas, something that my predecessor had not wanted to do, or had tried to do but failed. And so I said, I have an opportunity here. I will take that opportunity, and I ran, and I had the highest number of votes at that time in the history of Colombia. And there's something very peculiar. My first election was one with the support of the center and the center right. And my re-election, because the peace process became very controversial, I was re-elected with the votes of the center and the left. So they say that I'm the only president in the history of Colombia where all Colombians have voted for me at a certain moment in time. And that was true. But that also gave me a lot of governability, ability to govern, support in Congress and support of different political interest, and that was very important.
You told me the other day, Mr. President, about a congratulatory call you got from the United States that you enjoyed a lot. Can you recount that story for us?
Oh yes, it has to do with KU. I didn't know President Obama. I've never met him. I knew many other senators. For example, Senator McCain became a very good friend of mine because I told him beforehand of a beautiful operation where we rescued 3 Americans from the heart of the Amazon jungle from the guerrillas and delivered them to their families. And I told Senator McCain what I was going to do, and he was very grateful, and we became very good friends. Anyway, I did not know President Obama. But when I was elected, he called me. That's normal procedure. And of course, he had read my curriculum, and he made a joke. And he said, next time that your basketball team, the Jayhawks, are going to lose because they had a few days before lost the national championship, please let me know because I bet some money and I lost it. And next time, give me some information so I can recover my money. So I said, well, President Obama, now that you make reference to my education, I said, you know what the Republicans say about my education? And he said, no, what do they say? I said, that I was educated in Kansas and corrupted in Harvard. And so that joke was very important to break the ice. And we became quite good friends with President Obama. During my 8 years, he really supported me in many, many aspects.
That's a great story.
Humor.
Thanks for sharing it with us.
Humor is extremely important in life in general, but in politics also, and the personal relationships are extremely important in public service, and especially if you're being a president or a high official, those personal relationships that are nurtured by humor are extremely important.
That is indeed so true. And Senator Bob Dole, who is the person who started the Dole Institute and whose name is on the Dole Institute, had quite a sense of humor. So very good point there, sir. Could you take a few moments to recount the history of the Civil War before you took office as president?
Yes. Back in the early 60s, there was back in the early 60s, there was these revolutionary forces that started to be present in Latin America, and there was this special guerrilla force, the FARC, the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, who started as being a very small group that went against the 2 political parties that were sharing power. And a mistake that these 2 political parties made was to sort of exclude other political forces. And so they went into armed struggle, inspired by the Cuban Revolution, by the communism, by Marxist Leninism, and they started to grow and grow. They were a rural guerrilla, and they ended up dominating about 1/3 of the country. Very powerful because they financed themselves afterwards with the drug traffic, and so they had a lot of money, and they had an ideal geography, an ideal country for guerrilla warfare. Colombia is a country with a lot of mountains and a lot of jungles, and that is very convenient for guerrilla war. So they start to grow, And they ended up being very powerful, the most powerful guerrilla force in the whole of the Western Hemisphere when we started to make peace with them. They were Marxist, Leninist. They ceased to be communists now. They are now integrated into the democratic life with not a very high success, I must say. In the elections, they only had a very small support, but the damage that it had done to the country during all the war, these years of war, was tremendous.
Well, sir, after all those years of fighting, how did you manage to succeed in getting them to negotiate?
Well, it's a bit of a carrot and a stick. I had been studying other peace processes around the world and seeking advice of people that really knew about these type of peace processes. And they said, listen, all your predecessors have tried to negotiate with no success. Why? Because the guerrillas think that they can win the war. So one necessary condition was to change the balance of power militarily in favor of the state. And that's what was accomplished when I was Minister of Defense. We made a change, a dramatic change in our armed forces, in how we operated, in their legitimacy. And a second very important factor was intelligence. You need to have good intelligence to be able to be effective against a group like the FARC. And there I asked for help from the US, the CIA, the FBI, the British with the MI6, and we made a dramatic change in our intelligence. And we started to be able to go against what we call the high value targets, the most important commanders of the guerrillas that had been untouched for 45 years. And so another condition that I knew that was necessary was for the leaders of the FARC, of the guerrillas themselves personally, to be convinced that for them, it would be better to negotiate than to continue the war. So that was also a condition that was created because of our better intelligence hitting the high value targets. And at the same time, I started a diplomatic work with our neighbors. Many of them were supportive of our guerrillas. Chavez in Venezuela, Correa in Ecuador. They were very friendly. And another condition that is necessary for a successful peace process was to have the support of your neighbors and of the international community. And so I made peace with my neighbors with whom I had very bad relations, my predecessor also. But in order to have peace, I needed them to be on my side. And they were also interested in peace in Colombia because they were affected also, and so they started to help me. The US, President Obama, supported me. He even designated a special envoy to the peace process. And the international pressure and the military pressure brought these people to the negotiating table in good faith, because before they had always taken advantage of the negotiations to strengthen themselves politically and militarily. And so at this time I said, I'm not going to repeat that exercise. I will sit down with you if you show me that you are negotiating in good faith. And that's how we started to negotiate secretly for about almost 2 years the agenda. And I told them, if this leaks, because they love to leak because that gave them prestige, we will finish. And they asked for a ceasefire, and I said, no ceasefire. We only have a ceasefire when we have an agreement, and nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So putting the pressure, but at the same time having some empathy with them, understanding what is it that they wanted, what is it that really motivated them to go and fight and have themselves killed. And so a combination of that empathy with military force, with international pressure, was what brought them to negotiating table and to a successful peace process.
Well, sir, victims were very important in the process that you pursued. Can you tell us how you centered victims in that process?
Well, look at this very incredible coincidence. Today, 3 hours ago, I was in an event commemorating a law that we passed 10 years ago called the Victims' Law and the Restitution of Land. When I signed that law, the Secretary General of the UN came to Colombia saying, this is the first time that a country is recognizing the victims and seeking peace at the same time, and recognizing the victims before reaching a peace agreement. And the victims became the center of the negotiation. Their rights, according to the Rome Statute, their rights to justice, their rights to reparations, their rights to the truth, is very important, and the right to non-repetition. Those are the 4 rights that we seek to introduce in the peace agreement. And so the victims became the center of the negotiation. And that gave the process tremendous credibility, because we have more than 9 million victims. And so they became a very important support of the peace process. I remember when I started the negotiations, a former professor of mine, not from KU, unfortunately, but from Harvard, came to me and said, listen, you're going in a very difficult path, and you are going to have so much difficulties that you're going to be tempted to throw in the towel and say no more. In order to re-energize, talk to the victims, ask them about their dramas, about their lives, and that will re-energize you. And I did that as a matter of as a matter of discipline. Almost every week I talked to one victim. And I will tell you one anecdote that really impressed me and had a tremendous effect in my approach to the negotiation and my passion for peace. It's this lady from a state, a department in the south of Colombia. Her father had been killed. Her mother had been killed. Her 2 brothers had been killed. And her son was killed, but before he was killed, he was tortured. And about 15 days after she buried her son, having buried her brothers and her parents, somebody came and asked for help because he was wounded. And she opened her house and put him in the bed that was the bed of her former son. And this person was healed. And when he was going out to keep on fighting, he saw a photograph of this lady that had cured him with his son. And he sort of knelt down and said, "Don't tell me this is your son. Don't tell me this is your son." And she said, why? And he said, because I have to confess to you, and I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I was the one who tortured and killed your son. And this lady, her name is Pastora Mira, looked at him for about 30 seconds, said, stand up. He was kneeling and crying, stand up. And suddenly she embraced him. And this guy was saying, why are you embracing me? I just told you I was the one who killed and tortured her son. And she said the following, said, yes, but by what you just did, by confessing and saying you're sorry, you liberated me from hating for the rest of my life. That story for me was a beautiful story. And the victims, many of them kept saying to me, you must persevere, President. And I said, why are you so generous? Because the agreement that we are going to reach are going to give some legal benefits to the people, the perpetrators, the people who damaged or who hurt you so much. And they said, which for me was a lesson in life, they said, Mr. President, we don't really care. We don't want more people to suffer what we have suffered. And so the victims were very, very important for me in the process and for the negotiation. And also because this is the first peace agreement where the victims are the center of the negotiations, are recognized, are repaired, and that is the basis for a genuine reconciliation.
That is an extraordinary story, sir. In your book, The Battle for Peace, you list 6 different lessons about making peace. Could you elaborate on 1 or 2 of those and tell us why you think those are important?
Yes. First, every conflict, every armed conflict has different conditions. And you must be able to identify which are the necessary conditions that would facilitate a peace process. And don't simply wait for them to appear. You can create them. For example, one of those conditions was the support of your neighbors. In today's world, any asymmetrical war needs to be resolved, the support of the region. If you go to Afghanistan, for example, you will not be able to have peace in Afghanistan if the neighbors in some way don't support the peace process. And that is true of any armed conflict today. So that's one lesson. You need the support of the region and of the international community. Today, the international community, for example, is indispensable to apply what they call transitional justice. It's a different type of justice that we are accustomed to, but that's what facilitates a peace process. Another lesson that is very important is to put yourself in the shoes of your interlocutor, of your enemy or your adversary, and try to understand how he feels. Try to understand why he did what he did. And if you put yourself in his shoes, that will facilitate enormously to reach agreements on many issues. That is, in a way, called empathy, putting yourself in the shoes of others. That was a very important lesson. Another lesson that I think is important is many times it is very difficult to negotiate peace, not because the adversary is difficult, but also your own people, the people who are on your side, starts criticizing you because you're being too lenient or you're being too generous with the guerrillas, and this almost always happens. And this is something that must be taken into account. For example, when Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, negotiated the Camp David agreement with Arafat, he was then killed by some of his people because they said that he gave too much to Arafat. You go to the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, both the leaders of both sides that negotiated peace, their difficulty was with their own people. Afterwards, accepting the result of the peace process. So making peace is much more difficult than making war. Making war, and I had the opportunity of doing both. Making war is rather easy. The leadership you need in making war is a vertical leadership. You give orders, you rally the people around you, and you go after the bad people. And that's relatively easy to do as long as you're winning. You're losing, well, you're in difficulties. Making peace needs a completely different type of leadership. It's more horizontal. Instead of giving orders, you have to convince, you have to persuade, you have to have a lot of patience, and many times people don't understand what you're doing. So there's two different types of leadership that are needed, one for making war and another one for making peace. And fortunately, I had the opportunity of doing both, and that's a lesson that I think is very important for anybody to take into account when they want to make peace.
4 years after you visited us at the Dole Institute and after you had brought peace to Colombia, you were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. How did that feel?
Well, that was like a gift from God. I had just lost a referendum on the peace process 4 days before. There was the referendum. I lost it by a tiny bit, and I was devastated. How could I lose? All the polls said that the yes vote was going to win by 20-30%, and we lost by a tiny margin, but we lost. And suddenly I received a call very early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, from the Nobel Committee saying I had won the Nobel Peace Prize. And that was interpreted as a signal from the international community saying, no, you have already signed the peace, because I had already signed the peace with the guerrillas. You must not allow this to go wrong. You must continue. So what I did was to summon the leaders of the no vote, renegotiated the agreement, convinced the FARC, the guerrillas, that these changes were not that bad for them, and we had a new agreement, a better agreement. And I think that it was in part because of the Nobel Peace Prize at that moment. And of course, this is a very important distinction that I received in the names of the victims, because they are the ones who really deserved the prize and deserve the recognition, because you cannot imagine how people have suffered with this war for so many years.
Mr. President, I have one more question tonight. I know we're going to have lots of audience questions, so I want to get to them as quickly as I can. But can you tell us about your current organization, the Compass Center of Resources for Peace, and what your goals are with that organization?
Yes, the money that I received for the Nobel Peace Prize, I put into a foundation called the Compass Foundation. Compass means with peace in Spanish. And what we do is to bring people from the most remote regions the most violent regions, the ones that suffered the most in the war. We bring them to the best university in Colombia, give them a crash course on leadership, and we send them back in order for them to teach their communities, first, that you can solve problems without violence. Second, that you need a certain order and you need to create a sense of community. And this is something which is very important because making peace, a peace process always has two phases: peacemaking and peace building. Peacemaking is negotiating what they call the DDR, disarmament, the reintegration to civil society, and you cease killing each other. But peace building, which is more difficult, I say, is like building a cathedral. You have to do it brick by brick to reconcile a society. After 50 years of war, that is very difficult. We're still doing that. We still have a lot of people hating each other, and you have to build it from the bottom up. And that's what the Compass Foundation tries to do. Go to the most remote areas and sow the seeds of reconciliation.
Very good, sir. Thank you. We're going to go to audience questions now, and we'll get to as many of those as we have time for the rest of the evening. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly how to pronounce this gentleman's name, so if I butchered, I apologize, but it's Huntak. He asked, there is violence again in Colombia. What is a solution or advice from you on this problem, and how do you diagnose the current situation?
It's a very, very good question, because everybody's asking that question here in Colombia. We are suffering what we call a perfect storm. The current government has been quite hostile to the peace agreement, even though they are obliged by law and constitution to implement it. So many people are protesting because the government has not implemented the agreement fast enough and with the enough strength. At the same time, the pandemic brought chaos in terms of poverty. We went back 20 years. We had been one of the countries that it had the better performance in the social indicators, poverty and inequality. And the pandemic simply destroyed that, brought us 20 years back. And you have these young people who also are unemployed. Our unemployment rate is one of the highest in the whole of the region now, was much better before. And so there's a combination of different factors that have made people go to the streets to protest. And unfortunately, the government has not been handling this very well. They instead of establishing a dialogue and establishing channels of communication and to see how you can attend those valid reasons for protest, they decided to be much more repressive. And that has, in a way, increased the protest. And so we have been having a protest for about a month already, almost every day. I hope that we can get together, that we need the president, because he's the president, he's the leader of the country, to understand that he cannot continue to divide the country, but to unite the country. And almost everybody is willing to participate in that. If he summons the different political forces, we can try to agree on a way to build back better after the pandemic, and at the same time address part of the problem have taken especially the young people to the streets.
I've got another question that's a little bit similar, Mr. President. But Catherine asks, with the recent protests shining light on national policies dealing with healthcare and other issues, how can the government improve its relationship with the public amidst increased international attention?
Well, by establishing effective channels of communication. This is something that is very important in every respect, but we need to be able to have people feeling that they are recognized, that they are part of the system. Unfortunately, what has happened after the peace process and with this new government is that many of the expectations that people had about participating in the democratic process have been in a way hampered because there have been a policy of not establishing enough dialogue. I think that the key word here is dialogue. You need to be able to communicate. People want to be recognized. People want to be heard. And that's a key aspect in order to bring tensions down and solve the problems that we have right now.
Okay, sir, our next question is from Joe. Joe asks, what economic cooperation exists between Colombia and neighboring countries like Peru that could bring economic help to all income levels in Colombia?
Well, at this moment, situation is very bad in the region. We have countries, Venezuela, for example, or the Peru right now, Brazil, even Ecuador are in very bad shape, political shape. We had excuse me a moment. We had created a system of integration called the Pacific Alliance, which was working very well with Peru, with Mexico, with Chile, and that was working very well because we created synergies. But that, unfortunately, has collapsed because of the political situations in different countries. Chile is in bad shape. Peru, I don't know what's going to happen there. They're right now in very bad shape. No matter who wins, they're not going to have a very good governability. Ecuador is in bad shape. Mexico is in bad shape. Brazil is in bad shape. So unfortunately, we don't have at this moment the best partners in the region in order to leverage our economic performance. Colombia is a rich country. Colombia is a country that I'm sure that after the pandemic we will take off again. We have been a country with a very stable macroeconomic policy, and I hope that we can continue this and wait for other countries to sort of fix their internal problems and then reinitiate this integration in the region that is so important.
Okay, Mr. President, I've got a question from Daniel. Daniel asks, how has the public management helped contribute to the negotiations for the peace process?
How has the public management?
Yes.
Okay, well, if by public management you mean how does the public sector, what is the role of the public sector in the peace process? Well, it's very important because you need to articulate the different branches of government. You need to articulate the different powers, the Congress, the executive power, the justice system, in order to work together to facilitate the peace process and then to implement the peace process. And within the government, you need also a very good coordination among the different ministries, because usually a peace process have to do with the Ministry of Defense, also with the Ministry of the Interior, also with the Ministry of Agriculture, or with the Ministry of Health. And so you need a good coordination within the executive branch and also with the other powers, the legislative power and the judicial power. That is very important. Otherwise, reaching an agreement, but also especially implementing the agreement, becomes much more difficult.
Okay, our next question, I believe, is from our student advisory board. I think when you were with us in 2012, you got to meet a lot of our incredible students. This question says, in 2017 and 2018, how was Colombia able to welcome so many Venezuelan immigrants searching for asylum? And what was your approach in dealing with the economic crisis in Venezuela?
Well, when this migration started, I said to my fellow Colombians, Venezuela has been a very generous country with us. Because of our violence in Colombia, millions of Colombians went to Venezuela seeking a better future. Venezuela used to be the richest country in Latin America. They still are in the sense that they have the biggest oil reserves of the world. So I said, we need to be generous to the Venezuelans. We are going to give them, we're going to welcome them, give them health, give them education, and if need be, also give them a job. And I started a campaign to prevent xenophobia, to prevent people saying, oh, the Venezuelans are coming and are taking over our jobs. And that worked quite well. And people understood. And many Venezuelans that came here had a relative in Colombia, because we are two countries that have had a history of relations over decades. So it wasn't that difficult, but it got to a point where the pressure on our economy and our health system and our education system started to become a very high pressure or high cost. And that was when we started to regulate. And this government has continued to be very generous, to welcome the Venezuelans. It's become a bit of a problem because the xenophobia is appearing, and unfortunately, this problem will not disappear unless the Venezuelan regime disappears, because what has happened in Venezuela is the perfect example of how bad governments can destroy a country. Venezuela, being the richest country in Latin America, today is the poorest country in Latin America. And that is an example of bad government, of bad policies, and a country that has had a terrible performance. And I tell, also being a bit optimistic, my fellow Colombians, but wait, because sooner or later this regime is going to finish. Venezuela is going to recover, and the country that is going to benefit the most of that change, besides Venezuela, of course, is Colombia. And so I hope that this happens, hopefully, as soon as possible.
Sir, I have a very good question here. How did your experience as a journalist and director at El Tiempo newspaper help you build skills to become a world leader?
Well, being a journalist puts you in contact with so many aspects of life, of public life, and you start understanding many things that in other situations you would not understand. I think that the journalism helped me, for example, in in communicating better what I wanted to do. One crucial aspect of government is how to communicate your policies, how to sell your policies, to convince people to support your policies. And by being a journalist before, well, I had some experience in that. So I think, yes, the journalism helped me in my public career and helped me in my presidency. And I sometimes, when I was president, said, "Oh my God, how I enjoyed to be on the other side, being a journalist, criticizing the government. That was much easier than being on the side of the government, receiving the criticism." I talk that a lot with somebody who is responsible for this book being published in Kansas. His name is Ed Seaton. I'm sure that many of you know him. He lives in Manhattan, a great journalist, a great publisher, a great friend. He was one of the most important persons of the International Press Association, defending the freedom of the press in Latin America and in the United States. And in a visit to Manhattan, Kansas, some years ago, he was the one who suggested that I should publish the book in Kansas. And I said, great idea. And that's why we have this book published in Kansas. So I have to say that Ed Seaton was a great person to me, and a great journalist and a great advisor also.
Sir, I think you'd find a lot of political leaders around the world who would agree with you that they'd rather be on the journalist side than taking the criticism. So very, very good point there. Right now, let's see, I've got a few more questions. What was the hardest decision you had to make as you served as president of Colombia?
Well, I had to make very hard decisions, but maybe one of the toughest decisions was the number one leader of the FARC. I had already started the peace process, but I had set some rules with them. No ceasefire, we continue the war until we reach an agreement. And the commander of the army called me one evening and said, we have the leader of the FARC in sight. We can make an operation against him. What are your orders, Mr. President? And I had to make a decision on the spot. So I started to say, well, if I say no, don't harm him, don't go after him. Something that was absolutely crucial in the peace process was the support of the military for the peace process. And for them, this person was the highest objective, military objective. And that would create a tremendous problem with the military in the peace process. But at the same time, I had already started the peace process, even though the rules of the game were we continue the war until we have an agreement. But if we take down the number one, the guerrillas will simply finish the war, finish the process. But I said, no, I think they will respect me more for that. That was my own sort of justification. So I told the commander, do the operation, but try to capture him. Try not to kill him. I knew that he would not allow himself to be captured, that he would be killed, and he was killed. That was a very difficult situation for me at that time.
Yes, I can certainly understand. I want to remind everyone, please, that if you have a question for the president, go to Dole questions at ku.edu, send an email to that email address. We'll work it in. We've got two more. So if you've got one, get it in right away, and we'll try to do that. During your time as President Santos, what did you do to protect the indigenous population and the environment?
Oh, I love that question because before being president, I'm very conscious of the need to protect the environment. I went to visit one of the leaders of the indigenous people and sat with them, and they started explaining to me their culture, their philosophy, and I was so impressed that the day I became president, I went to ask them, we call them our older brothers because they had been in Colombia before anybody, to seek their blessing to be sworn in Congress that day. And they told me, make peace with the FARC, but also make peace with the environment. Because Mother Nature is mad because she's been mistreated. And she's going to also retaliate. Well, a week after, the worst Niña phenomenon hit Colombia, and my first year and a half in government was administering a flooded country. Rain and rain and rain. And in that process, I started to learn the importance of the environment, of our biodiversity. I remember that we brought in some experts. Vice President Gore went to Colombia or came to Colombia, and he gave me a lesson on climate change that I was very much impressed. And so I became a converted green, sort of convinced of protecting the environment. I did some very aggressive moves. Today, more than 20% of our country is protected areas. And we gave the indigenous people more rights, more land. They are the best guardians of our biodiversity. Colombia is the richest country in the world in terms of biodiversity per square kilometer. And the best guardians of that biodiversity are the indigenous people. And we, Colombians, were the ones who proposed in the Rio +20 summit in the year 2012 the Sustainable Development Goals that became the world agenda in the year 2015. That was a Colombian proposal. So we became very active, and I became very active, and I'm very active. Right now, I have a few boards, all of them related to the environment, because that, for me, is the most difficult challenge that humanity has, to stop climate change, to stop global warming, and to protect our biodiversity. And so I became, in the learning process, convinced of that, and we did a lot of things, and we still have to do a lot more.
Sir, I've got two more questions from the audience, and then we'll conclude our program. The first is, what do you wish the people of the United States better understood about the Colombia people or about the country as a whole?
Well, we have had a marvelous relationship with the United States. For many, many years, there has been a bipartisan support for Colombia. I am very grateful with both the Republicans and Democrats, for example, with the Plan Colombia, which helped Colombia to recover from being practically a failed state to be one of the leaders in the region in terms of the economic and social and infrastructure and many positive aspects. And that was done with the help of the United States. We have today United States in Colombia in the polls. You ask about Venezuela, and people don't respond very favorably, but say United States, and they have a very high opinion of the United States. Of course, you find all kinds of different views here towards US and US towards Colombia. But overall, I would say that there's a good chemistry between the two countries. We appreciate and we admire the United States, and I think the way that the United States has helped us and has viewed Colombia has been overall in a very positive approach.
Mr. President, could you tell us who are your role models and who taught you the most valuable lessons about leadership?
Well, I am a Churchillian. I have read almost every biography on Churchill. When I lived in London for 10 years, I became very a fan of the British statesmen, Disraeli and Gladstone, but especially of Churchill. I have tried to emulate him in many ways. But at the same time, Nelson Mandela has been a person that I met. I became a friend. I am now a member of something called the Elders, which is a group that Mandela created 11 years ago, of former world leaders to try to promote peace and reconciliation and climate justice around the world. And his teachings, his example, was for me also very important in reaching the peace process. I remember he was, when he taught me about the importance of the victims, I went to Johannesburg to give him the chair of something called the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. We were supposed to meet for 15 minutes. We ended up talking for 5 hours. And that was one of the most marvelous conversations I had. And out of that conversation, I started studying Mandela, what he did, his approach to his adversaries, and that helped me a lot in the peace process and in politics in general.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to remind all of our audience that the president's book is called The Battle for Peace. It was published, as he just told us a few minutes ago, by the University of Kansas Press. It's an outstanding book and an outstanding look at what we've discussed for over the last hour. We would encourage everybody to buy copies of it, and we'll be able to provide book plates from the Dole Institute. Look at the bottom of your YouTube page, the Dole Institute YouTube page. It will tell you how to do that. But Mr. President, it was so awesome to host you in 2012, and it's tremendous to have had this opportunity again tonight. We want to thank you very much for joining us and wish you the best.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all. I hope to be personally in Kansas as soon as this pandemic allows me to go and cheer for the Jayhawks. Last time I was cheering for somebody for Kansas was in the Super Bowl, and I went to Kansas after the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. I was in Miami and went to Kansas, and I hope I can repeat that in the not too distant future.
That would be fantastic, sir. Well, thank you very, very much. I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. It's been an extraordinary program, and we look forward to seeing you this fall at the Dole Institute when we'll be back to doing our programs in person. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining the Dole Institute of Politics for our program this evening. If you are a student and would like to join the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Also, you can join us on July 1st at 3 p.m. for the next installment of the Fort Leavenworth series, where Dr. Kurt King will discuss Mikhail Tuchachevsky, Soviet Theory, and Operational Warfare. You can access the program on the Dole Institute's YouTube channel, just like tonight's program. If you enjoyed watching this program on our YouTube channel, Please click the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and you can click the bell icon to receive notifications when we post new content. Also, consider becoming a friend of the Dole Institute by helping us to make programs like this possible. You could refer to the doleinstitute.org for up-to-date information on all of our upcoming programs. We hope that you enjoyed this evening's program. Thank you and good night.